Hello, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. I'm David DeCosmo, and this is a special holiday edition of ECTV Live. My co-host is away for the holidays, but we're glad to be here in a unique setting as we take a page from Charles Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol. We're going to look at Christmas and New Year's past. To do that, what better place than the Swetland Homestead, one of the oldest homes in northeastern Pennsylvania. And our host today, our tour guide, will be Mark Rossetti Jr., who's with the Historical Society. And Mark, you are dressed a little differently than what I'm normally seeing you.
Yes, we're dressed in our Victorian Christmas garb because we usually entertain for the holidays, and I portray George Swetland.
All right, and this of course was the Swetland homestead, and this was built when?
The original part of the house was built in 1803. The house, as it's currently constructed, was finished in 1840, and then has been modernized and updated since. But they're actually, the Swetland family has owned the land since the 1760s.
All right, now we're talking about Christmas and New Year's, and anybody who is considered a senior citizen today, myself included, probably thinks of Christmas past in terms of the lights blinking on the tree, the tinsel on the tree, the Christmas carols, maybe even the train going around the tree. And as we're about to see, things are not always that way. Let's start right in this room where you've got the fire just started up, and tell me, if I were here at this era at Christmas time, what would be special about it?
Honestly, nothing. Not in this area. Christmas was not celebrated in the early part of the 19th century, the latter part of the 18th century. So late 1700s, early 1800s, the founding era of America, it wasn't a big thing. Now, some of the American nobility, if you will, George Washington famously would have 12th night parties, but that was really the elite. That was the upper crust. Around here, especially in Luzerne County, the Dennisons, which would have been the closest neighbor at the time, about a mile and a quarter down the road, the Swetlands, it was just another day. You may remember the birth of Christ. You may celebrate the birth of Christ. But other than that, there's no decorations, as you could see, anywhere. You wouldn't have really a major dinner. You might have a slightly larger meal, but it wouldn't be anything special. You wouldn't cook anything special. And you really would go about your business. It'd be the middle of winter, so the farming would be done, but you'd still have a lot of cooking, a lot of cleaning, wood chopping. Belding Swetland was a blacksmith, so he would still have work in his blacksmith shop. And really, the early decorations didn't really start until 1805, 1810 around here. They were seen as taking away from the holiday. We were forgetting the birth of Christ. So it wasn't very popular at that time.
Well, we still followed a calendar, obviously. So what about New Year's and New Year's Eve? We think back again of the ball coming down on Times Square, and again the seniors, Guy Lombardo, a little newer, he had Dick Clark, and that has evolved. How about New Year's then?
New Year's would again pretty much be just another day. You would get together with family. You would reminisce about the year that had just passed. You would talk about your hopes for the year going forward. You would talk about what you have planned for the year going forward. But there certainly weren't the wild parties we know today. There certainly weren't large get-togethers. And of course, no rock music or anything in the 1790s as well.
Sure. Well, we're going to head over to one of the other rooms where we can depict just how Christmas finally was initially celebrated. As we go, let me hand you the mic, because I want to ask you a question about what about at this stage of existence here, what about, was there danger? I know there were still Native Americans in there, so what about that?
Well, I often tell school groups that come through, this area was the Wild West long before the Wild West. The proclamation line prior to the Revolution was only a little bit past where we are now. You did have a large Native American presence, as you mentioned, Dave. You had a large wild animal presence, coyotes, mountain lions, numerous ferocious beasts. So there was quite a bit of danger. There was, of course, health, sanitary factors as well. Of course, the river was much cleaner than it is today, but still you didn't have modern plumbing, you didn't have modern sewer systems, you didn't have modern health care or dentistry. So there was quite a bit of danger. The average life expectancy was not that great. Although that being said, Luke Swetland, who originally purchased the land and who was a survivor of the Battle of Wyoming, he lived to his 80s. So he bucked the trend. And that worked pretty well, but there was a decent amount of danger, things we take for granted today that existed back then.
Okay. Now, here we have a room that does depict a different era in time and some amount of decorations available. So what would we see? What type of year are we talking about here, for instance?
This is currently decorated right around 1815, and this would be the earliest decorations in this area, at least, for Christmas. And the idea at the time was, if you're going to celebrate, if you're going to decorate, bring the beauty of nature inside. So you have a lot of greenery, you have a lot of pine cones, you have a lot of holly berries. Other types of fruit could be used. We don't have a lot of them here aside from the apples, because they would have an orchard, so they'd have apple trees, different things like that. But depending on where you were and what you grew, you would decorate with the fruit you know. You'd have a very, very small tree. The earliest trees started to come around this time. It was primarily a German and Dutch tradition. They brought that over from the old world with them. However, it was starting to take root. It wasn't the full-on normal tradition that we know today where everybody has a Christmas tree. But it was starting to take root, and obviously they're much smaller. And you would decorate them with things you made. Again, you could use fruit, or in this case, we have paper ornaments that are on the tree here. So it was very simple. Now, that being said, this is when you start to see some of the other traditions come in. You would actually have a larger meal for Christmas at this time. And the families would actually work, and they would save up a lot of foodstuffs, and they would store it. And we actually have our little card here that we use, our little cheat sheet. And you have roasted ham and cranberry sauce and goose. But the main thing, the big thing at this time, was oysters. Oysters were quite the delicacy, and you would have your Christmas oysters, and oftentimes in Wilkes-Barre and the surrounding areas, they would be imported from Philadelphia. So you'd take a little bit of your money that you've saved over the course of the year. Hopefully it wasn't a harsh winter. Hopefully you still have it left. You'd purchase some oysters from the market that have come up from Philadelphia, and you'd have a nice feast with your family.
Would a New Year's celebration then be pretty much the same? Again, a big dinner?
It would be pretty much the same, only smaller. New Year's still hasn't really taken off, but it's the same idea.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about at this stage of the existence of the Swetland home? You say you might have a big dinner, you might have neighbors. Were there many neighbors around?
Not so much. The Dennisons had a larger family. The Swetlands at this time had a very large family. One thing to keep in mind as you look at the room, until the end of 1815, when the first expansion took place, this room was the entirety of the Swetland home. Now, there was a loft over the ceiling for sleeping quarters, but it wasn't like there was another floor or anything on the house. It was just a sleeping loft. So, and at the time, Belding Swetland and his wife Sarah, they had 12 children. And Luke was still alive, because as we said, Luke lived to his 80s, so there were 15 people in here at various points. Plus, if the Dennisons had come down, they had a larger family, not quite as large. The Shoemakers were living in Wyoming at the time. Back Road, of course, is named after the Shoemaker family. So you had a few. There were large distances between families, but the families were larger.
Well, that then brings this question. If you did have a family gathering, be it for a Christmas dinner or a New Year's celebration of any sort, might it not be likely that the people would come here and stay for the night?
They could have, yes. That did happen, especially depending on the weather. If there was bad weather, it was all horse and carriage. Wyoming Avenue was there. They called it the Great Road at the time. It wasn't, the 4-lane thoroughfare we know today, but it was there. It did exist. But it was still horse and carriage. It was sleigh. The Swetlands had a sleigh. So if there was bad weather, they would stay. If they were staying for, obviously a period of time, if they wanted to travel for a little bit, and even distances that we don't think anything of, even just coming from Trucksville to Wyoming, that was a distance great enough that you often would spend a few days in either direction just because of how difficult it is to get back.
All right. Did they exchange gifts at Christmas time?
Not yet. We'll get to that.
Let's get to that. I know we have more to see. Let's head over to your next exhibit, as it were. And I know, as you've indicated, Mark, fortunately, this building is in great shape, maintained so well, and you do various holidays, conduct tours so that people can come in and see what their own heritage, what the heritage of this area was really like. Now, this is such a gorgeous room. I think it's more like perhaps, what, Victorian age?
Yes, we're now into the early Victorian. I often portray this room as 1855 because I, as I said, portray George Swetland, who's on the wall there when he was a little bit younger. And unfortunately, George died in the beginning parts of the Civil War. So 1855 is about as late as I can go and still be accurate. As you can see here, now we are into a very familiar looking Christmas. This is the beginnings of what we consider to be, you know, modern Christmas. The Victorians, and especially Queen Victoria herself, they loved Christmas. You can see trees are beginning to get bigger. It's now no longer, it's still a very big German tradition, but now everyone's getting involved in it. You have hand-blown glass ornaments. The Swetlands actually had a general store as one of their businesses. They were one of the first stores in the valley to import hand-blown ornaments from Europe and begin selling them in the area. Candles on the tree, which is a wonderful tradition because, of course, there were no artificial trees in the Victorian era. And they would put candles on the tree and they would light them. And, of course, as we know, live trees like to dry out. So it wasn't a matter of if the tree caught fire, but it became a matter of when the tree caught fire. And oftentimes, they would have a fire bucket because Victorians were very afraid of fire. That was a great phobia of the Victorian age because the houses were wood and you have these big draperies and a lot of wallpaper, very flammable things. So they knew the risk of the candles and they would often put a fire bucket under the tree. Interestingly enough, some entrepreneur came up with the idea that, well, if we make them Christmas decorated, they'll actually leave them out. They won't hide them. So they began to sell Christmas buckets.
Christmas buckets. You say there would be one under the tree. What is a Christmas bucket?
You would just fill it with water, and when you'd be sitting around and say, oh dear, the tree's gone up again, you would just reach to the bucket and throw it, and hopefully it would put it out. We have one. We don't have it out this year because we've have some new items because by this point, gift exchanging is beginning. Right. So we have some period gifts under the tree this year, so we don't have a fire bucket because obviously I don't light the candles when I'm here.
And the gifts that you might see, such as those represented here, would be primarily, I'm gathering, handmade type gifts.
Yes, they would be handmade type gifts, and as you can see by looking at them, they skew young. Adults still primarily were not exchanging gifts unless you had maybe a lady or a gentleman you fancied, then you might try to give them something. But for the most part, it was exchanging with the children. Another great tradition at this time, especially if you were a little bit better off, more well off like the Swetlands were, was you would collect baskets of food and distribute them in town. And so we actually have documentation. The Swetlands had a sleigh, which we still possess. They would fill it with breads and fruits and things, and they would go into town on Christmas Day, and they would hand out their foods after church. So that was neat. So it's primarily for younger. Now, again, you would have a large feast. It'd be a slightly different menu. It'd be much grander. The main, instead of oysters, the main thing now was pineapple. Pineapple was a very big Victorian delicacy. It was difficult to get at the time. It was quite expensive at the time. It's a lot of fun when you give a tour to ask people if they went and bought their pineapple and they look at you like you've just stepped out of the loony bin. But that was a big Victorian thing, and as well as the early Christmas crackers.
What are these? Are Christmas crackers?
Yes. Now they're actually very neat. Now these have been.
When we say crackers, it's not like a Ritz cracker.
No. The name comes from, these have been disarmed. They don't have the strings in them, but the original ones were something you would give to a lady you'd fancy. And when she pulled the strings, the bow would come off and it would unroll, and there'd be a little poem or a love note or anything in them. Well, they were a terrible failure. They were a flop. They didn't do very well. So someone took it back and said, well, what makes everything better? Gunpowder. So they actually put a small charge in here, and you would pull the strings while you're having your Christmas dinner, and it would go off with a satisfying bang, basically like the snaps that the kids have today. Sure. But those were the Christmas crackers, and you would buy them in rather large quantities. So
coming to mind immediately is the movie A Christmas Story. You'll shoot your eye out.
Yes, you blow your fingers off.
And here we're dealing with black powder, which, as we all know, can be a little dangerous. What are the other items that we see here? This, for instance.
That is actually William's eyeglass case, and those
Ah.
are his set of glasses. That's William on the back wall just in front of us over there, and he was the family patriarch, and so those are his items there on the table. And then we have another small present and some candy as well.
So we're coming around to something a little bit more like, we see this evolving into more like the Christmas that we know, but it's still evolved even further. So I know we've got another room to take a look at, and that's down the hall over here. Obviously, too, let me not just pass without saying, entertainment. You had to have entertainment, so hopefully you had someone in the house that was well-versed in playing the piano, not necessarily Christmas carols as we know them, but some sort of music, yes?
Correct. Being able to play music was a great Victorian trait, not just a piano. This is actually a flute that belonged to a family member as well. The very interesting thing is on the piano, you'll see sheet music. That is the Wyoming Waltz. That was actually custom made for Maggie Swetland for her debutante ball, which they had in this room. Her father sent for a composer from Philadelphia and commissioned this song, and she entered the room and had her first dance at her debutante ball to the Wyoming Waltz. So music was a very important part of society at this time.
Let's head over and see our next era that is represented. It's interesting how you can take the available rooms here and really make use of them in terms of going from one era to another. Now, in this case, the room serves two purposes. We have a tree, but in this case, it's specifically decorated and for a specific reason. Perhaps we can address both how Christmas was celebrated in this era and also address the uniqueness of that tree as it fits into this room.
Well, we're in William's office now. This is his bank president portrait. He had many, many businesses. Pittston Bank was one of his businesses, as he had a stock certificate there signed by him. So normally the office would never be decorated. And so as an interpreter, this becomes interesting because you obviously don't want to close off a section of the house. So you have to come up with a creative way to do it. Well, the Swetland family was actually part of the very first commemoration of the Battle of Wyoming. It took place in 1878 on July 4th, and of course has been going on ever since. Right. But the keynote speaker for the very first commemoration was actually President Rutherford B. Hayes. They wrote to the president, and he wrote back and said, "I'd be honored to. I have no other pending business." And he came into town, and he actually stayed with William's daughter and son-in-law just down Wyoming Avenue in the big yellow mansion that's still there. It still stands. That was where the president stayed, and then they went across the street to the monument before going into Wilkes-Barre, and then he stayed a few days in the Wyoming Valley Hotel afterwards. So with that in mind, we made this room 1878, the year he came, and we decided to do a patriotic tree. Now, these really got big during World War I. 1917, 1918, these were a major fad, but they did actually have their roots in the late Victorian era. And so when that began, you would basically take a tree, and if you notice now, we've gone from 1855 to 1878, so the trees are much larger. They're basically the size that we know them today. And you would simply decorate it with red, white, and blue. So you would have garland, you would have ribbons, you have flags. Of course, we ran out of the appropriate number of flags that have the appropriate number of stars on them. So we went and we got a menagerie. You see they have different dates on them, so all different numbers of American flags, and you could still put a few hand-blown glass Christmas ornaments on it, and you would still put your presents under the tree. Now, by this time, gift giving has begun to expand. It's begun to get older in range, larger in range, although it's still not quite the way it is when Coca-Cola took over in the 50s, but it is becoming more modern. And so this is our interpretation of a Victorian patriotic tree. Not all of the items are original to the period, obviously, but quite a few are. And so it serves its dual purpose of being both part Christmas, but as well as sprucing up a room that really guests would never come in.
And the tree now having evolved through several years, there are other things that I noticed that are common to the rooms. Garland above the fireplace is very common. I see wreath in here as well.
Yes.
Now, here again, I guess you'd go back almost in a sense to what you said earlier about bringing nature in.
Yes, you want to bring nature in. You want to color the rooms, because while the Victorians, especially with their wallpaper, were very high and colorful and ornate and gilded, Again, in an office setting, it doesn't really matter, so you're not going to see it. So you want to just bring some color. We have some more garland and beads over the bookshelves. We have some apples, again, from the orchard. The Swetlands had an orchard for many, many, many years. They're on the desk in the back. You would just want to bring in reminders of nature, because let's face it, winters around here can be harsh. And it looks very pretty in the spring and summer and even into the fall, and then when you have 3 feet of snow on the ground and you're huddled around the fireplace, sometimes you want a nice reminder of what it was.
Sure. And again, I'll ask about New Year's, because we're celebrating both over these weeks at Electric City Television. So when did the New Year's parties come into their own in this type environment?
This is when you begin to see the early, what we would consider modern New Year's celebrations. The Victorians loved a good party. They loved a reason to get together, to socialize, to drink, to smoke, to play cards, to play music, as you alluded to earlier. So this is really when you start to see it. People would get together, they would stand around the piano, they would sing songs, they would reminisce about the year past, they would look forward to the year going forward, and they'd have a few drinks.
I'm curious as to what kind of reaction you get when you bring people through and they see this evolution of Christmas, especially the younger folks who have those more current memories. Is this quite a shock to them to realize that Christmas wasn't always as we see it today?
It is quite a shock to them, especially in the earlier rooms when Christmas really wasn't celebrated. So, and we often try to use that. You use that initial shock to go with them. So we ask them, do you know what Christmas was originally? Because of course it was the Saturnalia originally. It was more of a pagan feast, and that Christianity basically plopped a holiday over to stop some of the pagan rituals. And for the older kids, sometimes they go, oh, okay, and then a lot of times for the younger kids, you have to tone it down or it'll go over their heads. But to see the evolution, and then when they come through the back part of the house and see that it's a recognizable form of the holiday, it's really very cool. And it's kind of funny, too, because you'll have a lot of parents go through and be like, oh, see how good you have it. They didn't even have Christmas back then, and they didn't have this. And so it really is a neat evolution as you watch them. And then at least when I give the tours, I try to stay in character, in period, as much as possible. So if anything is alluded to that's modern, I play dumb, and I don't know what they're talking about. And usually by about the end part of the tour, when they get to modern Christmas, they've caught on to that, and that's a neat little thing for them as well.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about what time, at what place, St. Nicholas evolved from Europe to come on over here as Santa Claus.
Well, we have references to Sinterklaas in the valley as early as the 1810s. But that was really a die-hard German, Dutch, Catholic. The Swetlands, being Methodists from England, wouldn't have done any of that. By the Civil War, it's become a bit more widespread. You start to see some more of the early characterizations of it. But really, Santa Claus as we know him today is a 20th century marketing strategy, really, if we're being brutally honest, that has just taken off to the extreme.
Well, it's so good to know that these things have been preserved. And as we've been walking through the home here, and we've been focusing on the Christmas decorations and the change in those decorations, I hope that perhaps you've also noticed all of the other things that have remained here, period furniture, that has been so well preserved by the Historical Society. And this is what you would see if you came here at Christmas, if you visited the Swetlands. You would see this type of furniture. You wouldn't see the Barca lounges and the huge sofas that open up so your feet can rest. And the only thing that has been modernized here, Mark, I guess you have, for practical reasons, added electricity to this particular building.
Yes, we've added electricity and we've added heat, although even both of those, it's interesting. A lot of the fixtures, especially in the hallway and in the 2 rooms we were in prior, are the original gas fixtures that were converted to electricity, which is why they can be a little futzy sometimes. And as well as the heat system, in the 1880s, the Wilkes-Barre Record did a story on this house. This was the first house in the area to have a modern central heating system, which at the time was a coal boiler in the basement with just ducting running to each of the houses, blowing the updraft through. So there actually was a form of central heat and a form of lighting that we have just taken in the 1950s and converted.
Well, again, I appreciate your taking the time to give us a look at the ghost of Christmas past, as it were. And I think perhaps it may be time for you and I to retire to the room with the fire, and we'll see if we can find any oysters there.
Yes.
And just enjoy Christmas. And so to all of you who are watching, I again wish you a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. I'm David DeCosmo for this special holiday edition of ECTV Live. And until we see you again next time, here's hoping all that your news is good.